morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to all of our viewers and members for your ongoing support. Please stay tuned for just 30 seconds at the end of this program so that you can find out how you can contribute to help us to keep these quality programs ongoing. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, a Fireside Chat with Guy Raz, host and editorial director of NPR, with our moderator, the Honorable Maria Contreras-Sweet, 24th Administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration. Guy Raz is author of the new book, How I Built This, which is about the idea of entrepreneurial possibilities and tips on how to launch a successful venture, even in the midst of a pandemic. For those of you who would like to submit questions to Guy and Maria, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions, and Claire will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. So without further ado, Guy and Maria, it's Monday. It's time to bring you on for this very interesting conversation. Hi, Maria. Hi, Guy.
Kim.
Take care. Thank you.
Kim, it is such a pleasure to be a part of all the wonderful work that you are doing. I am so proud to be affiliated. I was a board member about 100 years ago, and I'm delighted to be able to be back to provide such an important program like our very special guest today, Guy Raz. I'm particularly excited about this one because obviously entrepreneurship is something that I respect, have endured, and have tried to promote and scale not only domestically but abroad. And so Guy Raz, you are one of our heroes. You are one of the ones who, I call you a double threat, because one, you are an entrepreneur, and two, you are promoting entrepreneurs and really trying to lift up America. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you sincerely.
Thank you so much for having me. And just to add to your praise of the LA World Affairs Council, I grew up I'm speaking to you right now from Northern California where I live, but I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. And as a kid, my parents used to take me to LA World Affairs Council events. And I saw Javier Perez de Cuellar, the UN Secretary General in the 80s, and Alan Cranston and John Tunney, all these old California names. So it's pretty cool to be at an LA World Affairs Council event, virtual, but still pretty cool. So thank you for having me.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, what happens is, whether we have a pandemic or not, sometimes we get caught up in our own world. And it's really important to be affiliated with an organization like this because it allows you to sort of raise your head, look up, and see a larger view of the world. So thank you for that. Anyway, we're delighted to get into this. So let me just say that, number one, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
That's the way we leverage ourselves, right? I mean, so many people will hopefully come to hear your podcast, but to the extent that we're somewhere where, for whatever reason, it's nice to have the book as well. So thank you again and congratulations. Let's just get right into it. First, when as we say, at some point there was a pivot, there was a turn. Tell me what excited you about entrepreneurship, why you made this the focus of your work, and just sort of tell us a little bit about Guy Raz and what brings you to us today.
Well, as some of you know, I've been with sort of an NPR voice for most of my career. And I think in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I really began to think about what I do. And what I do is tell stories. I tell heroes' journeys. And I began to see those parallels in the stories of people who start businesses. You know, I began to see those journeys, and it really kind of inspired me to create this show and to build a show that builds on this idea of entrepreneurship. And that's sort of how it began.
We know that small businesses, although we always focus when we're in government, we focus on subsidies for the large. We know that it's the small businesses that create a majority of our jobs. So 2/3 of our net job growth comes from the small businesses. And of course, small businesses employ a majority of our employees across America. And for me, one of the reasons I think entrepreneurs as heroes is because when I think of any town, the malls begin to look alike until you see the small business, until you see that small bakery, the restaurant, right? The microbrewery. That's what attracts us to towns is, we can go to the large department stores, which are wonderful anytime and anywhere.
Yeah.
But it's that small business that really makes a town very special. And it's usually the one that gives us our first job. So
Great.
again, so that's why it's important for us to talk about this. I'm sure we have quite a few entrepreneurs who are listening to us this morning. So let's just say one of the stories that I love, if I can just get right into it, is the Mcbride story. Because here's a couple of sisters who have no money, no experience in small business, no experience in what they're about to undertake, and yet there's many lessons that we could learn from that story. Could you share that one with us?
Yeah, it's an incredible story, and we actually released that episode just today. It's the story of two women, Andrea and Robin Mcbride, both born 9 years apart. They share a father, but they had different mothers. Neither sister knew the other existed until they were in their 20s. Andrea was raised in New Zealand, and Robin was raised in Monterey, California. Neither of them knew their father very well because their mothers had divorced or split up with their dad when they were very little. And their father died. And when they found out about their father's death, they reconnected in the United States. Andrea came from New Zealand and met her sister. And their mothers were both white and their father was black. And they saw each other in the mirror when they encountered one another at JFK Airport for the first time. At the time, Robin was in her late 20s. Andrea was, in her late teens, and they reconnected and bonded and ended up, completely, basically restarting their lives together as sisters. And eventually, they started a wine business. They had, as you say, they had no money. They had no connections. They had no experience in the industry. It was an old boys network. Here you had two women of color who were entering a primarily white and male industry, and wine is also just the sort of a rarefied world. And they wanted to create a brand that would make wine accessible for everyone, for young people, for people who might be intimidated by the world of wine. And they wanted to create great wines that were affordable and wonderful. And it's been 15 years now, and today it is the largest Black-owned wine business in the United States and one of the largest in the world. They are remarkable women based in Oakland, California. They produce wine from New Zealand and from California, and it's outstanding wine, absolutely wonderful wine. It's available pretty much everywhere. You can go, Walmart and Target, and also on their website. But the story of how the two of them came together through incredible loss and incredible hardship growing up to build this amazing business is so inspiring. And that's the point of my show. The point of my show, Maria, is to inspire people who are thinking about starting businesses, who are in the middle of building a business, or who just want to be inspired by a way of thinking, a mindset. It really is designed for anybody who is looking for a way to just be inspired about business, about the way they work, about the way they think about work. And this story it sort of exemplifies what I'm trying to do on how I built this and what I'm trying to do with entrepreneurship. Because look, as you know, I mean, you ran the Small Business Administration under the Obama administration, and we know what it means to represent the best of entrepreneurship. There are different kinds of entrepreneurship, right? There are entrepreneurs who may not reflect the values that you and I have, that we want to present. And so what I try to do on my show and in the book is really to highlight entrepreneurs who reflect integrity, who are kind, who are moral, who have incredible character, and who have built amazing brands that are having an impact on our world and our culture. And that to me is the best of entrepreneurship. And that's really what I'm trying to do with the show and with the book.
Right, but Ross, thank you for that. And it is a very special story. I completely recommend it. But let me just say what I think some of our audience may want is the actual technical aspects of it. You know, like how they were able to access capital. Was it through venture? Was it through, one of the things that we know in America is that access to capital for entrepreneurs has not been there. For example, what we know is that VC capital is concentrated in 3 states and in 25 zip codes, and that's California, New York, and Massachusetts. And we know that that's a concentration that's unbelievable. And we know that not all the good ideas come from those 3 states. And so people have had difficulty. Today, of venture capital, women access about 3%, Latinos about 1%, and African Americans about 1%. And so I think the story that you described, it's about, number one, how they were able to secure capital, because that's a challenge. And certainly at the US SBA, as you aptly point out, that was, fundamentally one of our 3 core offerings was capital through financial institutions and directly in some instances from the SBA. And we had venture capital and private equity and all sorts. So I do recommend that people go to SBA at least at one place to think about, understanding ways in which we can access capital. But are there lessons that you can share with the audience about accessing capital? And was there anything in particular about the Mcbride sisters that you think is worth sharing there?
Yeah, I mean, in their case, they bootstrapped it. So how did they bootstrap it? They had no money. I mean, Robin had a job at a company, and Andrea was just out of school at USC. They essentially were able to, because Andrea had grown up in New Zealand, she was able to contact small wineries in New Zealand, and essentially order wine, but with terms that it allowed her to pay for that wine once she got paid for selling it. And initially, they sold small quantities of wine to restaurants, to small wine stores, and so that's how they built their business very slowly. It took them 15 years to get to where they are today. They own 100% of their business. But what you're talking about, the access to capital from venture and private equity and so on, oftentimes people seek that money out, as you know, when it's a capital intensive business that requires manufacturing or production or a lot of software engineers, or B, if they intend to scale it very quickly, if they're looking to go off like a rocket ship in 2 to 5 years. The Mcbride sisters did what I think a lot of entrepreneurs do in the United States, and what actually a lot of people who've been on the show encourage other entrepreneurs to do, which is, as much as you can, to try and build it slowly, efficiently, and to use the cash you have, and to be very careful with it, and if you can, to take loans, because as you know, VC money and private equity money, that comes with a lot of strings attached. Not to say that's a bad thing. I mean, there are reasons why some businesses may seek that out, and some founders may seek that out. But I would say on my show and in the book, probably about 70 to 75% of the people end up not doing that. They end up figuring out a way to start their businesses small, and sometimes as a side hustle, to dip a toe in, while keeping a day job, while keeping their health insurance and other benefits. So that's what the Mcbride sisters did. They bootstrapped it.
That's what's so wonderful about America, our exceptionalism, right? Our resiliency, our ability to be resilient. I can tell you that when I was starting to build my bank, I felt that's why I think I identified with these women, was I had never started a bank. I had no capital to build a bank. Didn't know anybody who had built a bank, but I just said, if I want to help entrepreneurs, access to capital is so fundamental. And so the way we went about it was to actually do what I call a friends and family raise, just call everybody on my Christmas card list from California to New York, Florida, Oregon, Washington. And eventually we were able to get 400 people who helped us raise the capital. But what we saw in the financial institution was how the entrepreneurs would come and seek capital, but sometimes they didn't actually know how to deploy it appropriately. And so, as you aptly point out, it's not just about accessing capital, it's what's the character. If you're getting a loan, that means you can pay it back and still be well on your way. If you're getting VC or private equity, that means you're marrying them for a long time, because they co-own your business and have a say in how you run your business. And not just the character, but it's like of the capital, but also who's behind it, because what are their values? Are there shared values there? These are really important attributes that you want to be thinking about.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, look, we're starting to see some signs that there are venture groups that are really trying to create more opportunities. I mean, for one thing, you are seeing more and more funds in the Midwest, right? I just spoke to a group in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. You know, they've raised a significant fund there, $25 million fund. There are funds in Boston, there are funds in Chicago, there are funds all over the country. What's interesting now is some of the more prominent funds, the Andreessen Horowitzes and Sequoia Capitals, are starting to deploy funds and trying to create funds specifically to help entrepreneurs of color. You know, it's an open question whether that will move the needle significantly. As you point out, a very small percentage of venture money is going to women and to entrepreneurs of color, but I think that will inevitably change, because if you look at the pool of entrepreneurs today, they reflect the population in the United States. And the population, as you know, of younger people in the United States is far more diverse than the population of older folks in the United States. And so, you know, not just anecdotally, but even, you know, well, I can tell you anecdotally in so many conversations I have, both on the show and off the show, I encounter so many entrepreneurs of color who are now, you know, coming onto the scene. We just did an amazing episode about another amazing entrepreneur named Tope Awatana, who created Calendly, the online calendar system. He bootstrapped that company as well. And the way he did it was he was a sales rep for 11 years for a software company. And he lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Atlanta. He saved all of his money. He lived very inexpensively. He maxed out on his 401k every year. And when it was time to invest in the technology to create this business, he cashed out his 401k, which I don't recommend because you pay a penalty, but he did it. And he had about $80,000 or $90,000 in there at age 31 or 32. Maybe it was a little bit more than $100,000. And he worked with, he outsourced the technology for this software. Today he owns 95% of the business. It's a $70 million company that, you know, is used all over the country and has corporate clients like Zillow and others. So it's an amazing story. I mean, there are all kinds of creative ways to find capital, right, and to fund a business. And most of the time it starts really small, really small.
So he's self-funded, which is one more way in which you could do that. Pivoting quickly, because we have about 10 minutes left before we get into the Q&A, so I want to get everybody ready for their questions. The second question people ask me is always how to access the marketplace, right? And so locally, if you're, as you mentioned, you know, some of us want to be hobbyists, some of us want to be Main Street shops, some of us want to be manufacturing, and some want to be, you know, a gazelle, you know, and really grow and scale and eventually become a unicorn. And so, you know, so depending on where we are aspirationally, still the markets need to be thought about in your plan. And 99% of the world's consumers are outside of the United States, even as large as we are. And so we have to think about, even for small businesses, when I was in office, we really fought hard to make sure that our trade agreements weren't just built up for the large corporations, but that there was a small business chapter so that small businesses could find a place in which to resolve disputes, to protect their patents, and be able to navigate through the labyrinth of the, you know, the global marketplace. And so could you give us like what's in any of these stories, how some of your heroes think about the marketplace, and is there a particular example you want to share?
I mean, of course, it depends on the product, and it depends on the product or service. I think in most cases, and I think this applies all, you know, to any business around the world, you start locally, right? You start with what you know. You know, if you think about a good example is Kathleen King. Kathleen King, she sold cookies from her father's farm stand in rural Long Island. Eventually, people liked the cookies, so she got a small little space and built a bakery there. You know, it was $800 or $900 a month in rent. And eventually, she started to sell them to New York. city. She would drive them in, and eventually the Mid-Atlantic, and eventually the entire country. And eventually she sold her brand Tate's Bake Shop to Mondelez for $500 million. So and those cookies are distributed and sold around the world. So I think that that principle applies across the board, whether you are Kathleen King building Tate's Cookies, which was not her intention to make it what it became, but it became that, or Stuart Butterfield building Slack, which is enterprise software used around the world, who's also been on the show, or it's Howard Schultz and Starbucks. I think it's like anything that you produce. You take sort of one step at a time. There's a wonderful African proverb that I've quoted before, which is, how do you eat an elephant? And it's one small bite at a time. And that's essentially what you do with a business. As you know, a business is a series of problems, and it's hopping from one lily pad to the next lily pad, which is another problem, solving that and going to the next lily pad. And it's never ending. I mean, the problems become more manageable over time as your ambition grows and scales. And I think it also applies to how you look for new markets to provide and offer your products and services.
Right. What I find is that sometimes people will come to me and say, I want to start a small business, but I don't know, if this is the right model. And I always say, you know what? It's about finding a pain point in your life. You find something that is uncomfortable for you. I mean, I know that you know this story, and we have so many stories that we know in common. But for example, Sarah Blakely's story, I can tell you that growing up, and women will understand this, when you saw that there was a line in your, when you put on light colored pants,
a dress or trousers, sure.
And so you saw that there was a line. And so many of us women would get our pantyhose, even though we didn't need them, we'd cut off the feet because we didn't really want to we wanted to wear sandals, but we'd put on the pantyhose so that we could just, cover up the lines. And of course she saw that, like we all did, but she took action and actually created the company called Spanx. Yeah. And so there's so many times where I have an idea, I share it with my family, my children, my husband, and then they just sort of laugh at me and I don't act on it. And then, a couple of months later, you hear that somebody else acted on it. Yeah. And they did. And so it's about seizing the moment and taking the first step. And as I said, not, as you point out, it's not just about, do I have to have all these resources, but putting people around you, a really good CPA, a good lawyer, right? A good marketer, creating a sort of a family advisory board, if you have to make sure that you have the skill set around you to cover your blind spots.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's exactly right. Look, a lot of people, when they're starting out a business, they are reluctant to spend money on things like legal advice or accounting advice. Those are expenses that sometimes they're not as expensive as you think they are, oftentimes, but you need that. You need to build that in from the beginning, because it will protect you and it will help you build a more efficient product, a more efficient business. The other thing I want to say is, when people ask you, how do I don't know if my idea is going to work, or I don't know. I mean, there are a number of ways to answer that question, right? I mean, one of them is, most of the people who I profile in my book spend time researching, even if they didn't know an industry. If they didn't know suitcases, they learned about suitcases. If they didn't know about hand soap, they learned about hand soap. They spent, and the way you can do that today is unprecedented versus 20 or 30 years ago. The access to infinite knowledge we all have at our fingertips with our computers is unprecedented. So you can really actually, create a foundation and build a foundation around a concept and idea that you may not have a lot of experience in now. The other thing is, once you start a business, you will pivot. It will change. Your strategy will change. The way you operate will change. That's natural. You know this. You experience that yourself. And I think that's something that people need to understand, that you want to go in with a solid idea. You want to go in with some solid research behind you, and a solid understanding of the marketplace and the product market fit. But you also want to go in understanding that, like in war, the best plans always change. The best plans will always shift.
And speaking of shifting, Guy, we now find ourselves in a pandemic. And so this will be my last question before we take the Q&A. And so people are thinking about resiliency. They're thinking about a pivot. They're thinking about, what they do. And so it is important, as we talk about the kinds of people you have around you, that small, medium businesses, as well as the large, have to have a plan for some kind of a pandemic, as we now know. Like I always say, the three, right? The pandemic, there's a natural disaster, which some of us are experiencing as we speak, And then third is a cybersecurity attack. And so, you know, amongst whatever is unique to your business, but you've got to be prepared and be thoughtful about how you can be resilient or how you can pivot. And so, for example, a friend of mine just asked me the other day, you know, he has a gym and he says is having difficulty having his members come back into the gym. And so he's now down the street. He set up some, you know, the weights and things outside in the park, and people come there, and so they can work out there. And he's giving them, you know, the classes. And so there's a way to, you know, be creative about how you can pivot in your business to be resilient through these types of challenges.
This is the most challenging moment for virtually every business in the world. And you know, the financial crisis of 2007 and 8 and 9 was challenging. This is different because it's not just an economic crisis, it's a global pandemic. Add to that a political crisis in the United States and even in parts of the world. So there's no question this is a very difficult time. On the other hand, this is a time, this is a very interesting time to think about starting a business or to think about ramping up your business. If you think about the Fortune 500, almost half of those businesses were started during economic downturns. Look at the companies we talk about today: Slack, Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, Betterment. I mean, they were all started during the last financial crisis, you know, and those companies are resilient today in part because they went through that period, you know, more than a decade ago. So Airbnb is a great example. They went through the financial crisis. They had a hard time raising money. They went to 20 investors in 2008. They couldn't get a single person to invest, and you could have bought 10% of Airbnb for $150,000 in 2008. Now you look at the business today. In the first 2 weeks after the pandemic, their revenue dropped 60%, but they weren't panicking because they had already been through really difficult challenges and crises in the past. So they were very smart about their money. They were very quick to raise money, and they built in efficiencies that enabled them to withstand the shock. And now, you know, 6-7 months later, they're actually back to where they were last year at this time. So it's an interesting example of why I think there are arguments to be made that if you start a business in the midst of a low point, it actually bakes resilience into your business. It actually makes you stronger and tougher as a founder when you get out of this period, because inevitably there will be difficult times again.
I think that, you know, that lesson that you just said is so important. I just want to underscore it because so many businesses, you know, we talk about Kodak, you know, and how that was disrupted, right? Brian Chesky at Airbnb understood that. And as people stopped traveling, what he said was, what's the new pattern in my marketplace? And what he saw was that people still wanted to travel, but locally, so that they could stay within a certain distance. They didn't want to, you know, go too far. And so he then created new experiences right in the local neighborhoods and started advertising differently instead of traveling abroad. And let me tell you what's going on in Europe. In each community, he was advertising more locally what the local experiences were, and was able to, you know, beef up his business that way. And he treated his hosts, you know, I mean, I don't know the complete story, but from what I hear from some of the hosts is that he said, let me help you here, let me do, you know, really treated his customer base really nicely. So that's right. I mean, Brian Chesky, you know, I do love the new models. You know, I had Brian Chesky, he traveled with me to Cuba, or was it Morocco? But anyway, Brian says to Penny Pritzker, who is from the family of the Hyatt Hotels, you know, Penny's was concentrated in all these infrastructure, all the hotels, and Brian Chesky had the same market value, in fact, was exceeding their market value, and owned no hotels and was the largest
hotelier in the world.
Exactly. And so the new models are really, you know, right, the Uber system, you know, they don't have they don't own the vehicles, but they're the largest transportation system around. And so I think these disruptions are really quite interesting, but it talks about knowing your customer and tracking them, and then you can be resilient and come up with a pivot and a new response.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think we're going to open up now to Q&A. And so I'm going to ask Claire, are you going to lead us through the Q&A?
Yes, thank you. It's great to be joined by both of you. We'll dive right into our audience questions. We've got a lot coming in. And as a reminder to our audience, you can submit your questions on the GoToWebinar control panel. But the first one is actually addressed to both of you. So question to Guy and Maria. The pandemic has severely impacted small businesses, their owners and employees. Here in Los Angeles, long-standing iconic businesses have closed their doors. Where do we go from here?
Well,
I'll take a crack. Yeah, I'll take. Do you want to take a crack at that first, Maria? Yeah. Okay. Look, there's no question this has been an incredibly difficult time. I think something like 20% of small businesses in the United States will close this year. And it's particularly hit restaurants, the leisure industry, travel industry harder than other industries. I think that we are in a transition moment, right? One of the really interesting things that I read a few days ago was that the number of applicants for an EIN, the employee identification number, which is a prerequisite to starting a business, is actually 500,000 more right now than at this point last year. So it suggests that there are people who are looking for alternatives, people who may have had a brick and mortar that, where they can't pay the rent, but may pivot to an e-commerce site. This also, by the way, happened in 2007, 2008. If you look at Shopify, platforms like Shopify and GoDaddy and other platforms where you can actually build an e-commerce business, their revenue skyrocketed. All of a sudden, they were onboarding millions and millions of people who were pivoting from brick and mortar or a hybrid brick and mortar to e-commerce. I think you're going to see a lot more of that. I'm very, by the way, bullish on brick and mortar, in part because I think that, and as you know, as the person asking this question knows, we are social animals. We need human interaction. And I think the moment we can resolve this pandemic, if there's an effective vaccine, and hopefully better protocols, hopefully we have political leaders who will create better protocols for us, and we have a more responsible federal government, I think that we can tackle this. And once we do, I believe we will see an explosion in people wanting to reclaim that connection, wanting to go back out into the streets, wanting to go back to their local shops. And I know I do. I live in Oakland, California. I love going down Telegraph Avenue and seeing some of those local businesses. And I know a lot of those local business owners. So I really do think we're gonna see a resurgence once we get through this. But there's no question this is a tough time. And what can I say? It is a very difficult moment. And if you run a business now and you can figure out a way to keep your head above water, I think once we get through this, and I'm optimistic we will next year, I believe we'll see a resurgence in people wanting to come back to stores and shops.
I'll just add thank you, Guy. I think I would just make 3 quick suggestions. And one is that each of us now has to take our destiny into our hands. I don't know if that's an oxymoron, but and so what I would say, number 1, is when we talk about access to capital, what's frustrating to me is, as we were referring a little earlier to the large funds, you have to remember that these pension funds, these folks that we refer to that are running these massive funds that you hear about, whose capital is that? That is our capital. It is our pension fund. My pension fund is in there. When I retired from 7-Up or from Westinghouse or from the state of California or the federal government, these funds manage our funds. And so I think just like any other movement, we have to remind these gatekeepers that it's our funds and we want it back into small businesses. So I think we have to become, number 1, advocates. Number 2, I would say, I was delighted that in the same strain here, that the large corporations are now talking about not just the primacy of their shareholder, but also that they have to look at stakeholders. And so to me, that means, can small businesses go to the corporations in their state, in their county, and say, how can I become a part of your supply chain? I want to be able to provide you some products. If you sell cookies, can you get that corporation and the larger businesses to buy your cookies? If you sell a certain service, can they buy them? Because I think large corporations have a duty and obligation to make sure that they're also procuring from their local marketplace. And that goes also for cities, for counties, the state, and the federal government. They all have really formal and informal contracting opportunities to make sure that they're buying a certain percentage of their goods from small businesses. So I would urge small business to look at that. And third, for the longer term, I think it's important that we think about you know, we know that the future is coming, and this pandemic just accelerated that. And so to the extent that small business can think about, how can I begin to write a business plan that incorporates 5G? If you're not studying AI, you know, AR, augmented reality, you know, I think it's so important that we think about these future technologies to make sure that we're now using this time, this downtime, to get ready and plan for our next business that will really respond to future technologies, applications, and needs.
Thank you both. Moving on to our next audience question, I'd like to hear more stories of how people have been creatively and successfully launching new businesses during this pandemic. Is there a key thread that ties these success stories together?
I mean, I can tell you you know, with many, actually, what we did was on my show earlier this year was we launched a new series called the Resilience Series, where I've been bringing back many entrepreneurs onto the show to find out how they're doing. And what's interesting is that many businesses, as you can imagine, are struggling, and they're having a difficult time trying to figure out how to keep their businesses afloat. And what many of them are doing are building new businesses within their business. So one small example is Zumba. Zumba is a fitness platform, as many of you know. Alberto Proman is the co-founder. They saw, you know, they were worried that their business was gonna drop 80-90% once the pandemic hit, because gyms are closed and their business model depends on trainers paying license fees to Zumba. But when trainers can't teach Zumba, there's no revenue. What they did very quickly was they created a platform for their trainers to offer live stream classes. They did this in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, they mounted a platform that enabled all their trainers to offer classes on the platform, to charge for those classes. By the way, Zumba doesn't take any money for that. And what was fascinating about it was that had they tried to do this at a normal time, what Alberto told me was it would have been impossible. There would have been, you know, endless meetings. There would have been marketing meetings, strategy meetings. There would have been a rollout plan. It would have taken 18 months. They did it in 3 weeks. It wasn't perfect, but they've been improving it every single day since. And now it's an incredibly successful product that they offer. And that has changed the way Zumba will do business going forward. I've seen countless examples like this. Life is Good, the apparel brand. They saw their retail business drop 90%. Instead of hoarding their cash, they spent money on technology and equipment that enabled them to print T-shirts, mugs, all kinds of you know, artwork, apparel for men and women and kids, but to print it on demand. And so now they're offering shirts that say things like, you know, more science, less fiction, right? Shirts that reflect the zeitgeist. And they've seen a 300% increase in their direct-to-consumer model. So I'm finding all these examples of businesses really thinking creatively right now in trying to build resilience and build new models. I mean, it all comes from this idea that in a crisis, you have to operate in a radical way. And sometimes a crisis, as you know, I didn't coin this, within crisis, you will find moments of incredible opportunity. And I think that crises are times to not squander those opportunities.
Guy is exactly right. The Japanese word for crisis is opportunity. And so that's exactly right. And so what I saw, for example, you know, on your point about what we're seeing, I mean, everybody knows Instacart was a relatively successful company, but as soon as we couldn't do our own shopping or didn't wanted to honor the guidelines and stay in place, we saw that Instacart went off the charts. I have a girlfriend years ago, she was in Boston and there was a weather situation. And so they were all snowed in and she couldn't get out, but she needed to feed her dog and she didn't have any dog food in the house. And so she kept thinking about, how do I feed my dog? And it was a need, it was a pain point. And the more she thought about it, she said, who's going out to the store? And so she was calling friends. Are you going to be going out? Are you already out? Can you stop and pick up this dog food? And at the end of the day, she finally found a friend who would do it for her. And so she said, you know what, I can't be the only one that has this painful experience. And so she created TaskRabbit, And so people who can do errands for other people now are signed up, and you can go to TaskRabbit and ask for, some errand, and you pay them over the online. So yes, it's when you look at Instacart, Amazon's delivery system, the large, the midsize, and the small, they were all responding to somebody who couldn't get out of their home. And I think that as we think about those things, what are our personal experiences and how do we accommodate that? And I think that's the best way to think about it.
Thank you both. It also, what you just said reminds me of a small nonprofit event series who was told we couldn't do in-person events and quickly pivoted to doing digital programs. So yeah, I like all of those stories. They're very inspiring. This next person is bringing it to all of us. What are some small steps the average person can take to show support for small businesses?
Maria?
Well, in my view, I think the most important thing that we could be doing is at every turn shopping at a small business. They actually need customers. And so, I have a niece who has a dress shop, and her thing was the way she sold, the way she worked with you. She worked, with you as you came in and make sure that the color was right. And so she sort of did a little consulting as you were shopping in her store. So that is harder. There are some things that are a little more complicated. But I think to the extent that we think about, for me, I'll tell you, like just a little example here is I wanted to order something. I could easily have pushed the Amazon button, but I just said, no, I'm going to buy this from a small business. Now, the small business told me that for the same product, it would take me 4 to 6 weeks to get versus the 2-day Amazon. And I know this sounds a little bit of a commercial for Amazon, but I was genuinely saying to myself, no, I'm determined to support this small business. And I just made it a point to do it. And so now I'm waiting 4 weeks for my product, but I feel good about it. And so I think all of us have to go a little distance sometimes. But if we want these things to be resilient and to still exist when we get back online, then we have to go a little bit out of our way. So at every turn when I don't want to cook, I order from a local restaurant. And how much I've supported small businesses for so many years. We can fund a small business. We can do a friends and family raise. We can introduce them to other people that we know to make sure that, they get an introduction to their prospective customer. And so, we have to be all in, because truly, in my view, what makes America great is our ability to create and expand the middle class. We can go to countries like Spain where you can't file for bankruptcy. You can go to, so many other countries where you can't access capital at all. And when you fail, you owe forever. Your children and your grandchildren will inherit your debt. And here we have the ability to file for bankruptcy. And so we always say in small business, fail fast, because you can start something, maybe it doesn't work out, but you can move on and go on to the next business. You may have lost some savings, but at least you have the ability to. And so, but it's still a big sacrifice. So I would encourage everybody to do what they can to support and shop at a small business and fund them if you can, partner with them, advise them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think in addition to shopping at small businesses, any ways you could use your social media to encourage others to do the same. Posting a picture on Instagram or Twitter of a great ice cream shop that you went to, or a cool flower shop in your neighborhood, or just anything. That some ways that you can amplify what they do. And I agree with Maria. I mean, I think that small businesses are, and oftentimes the engines of innovation in America. I mean, it also it's a path to a sustainable life, not just for you, but for the people you employ. And so and by the way, I don't want to diss Amazon. We all use Amazon sometimes. But do we really want to live in an Amazon only world? I mean, imagine how uninteresting your streets and neighborhoods would be if every store was an international or national chain, and every product you got was from Amazon, and it was just the same. What makes our community so wonderful and vibrant and different are those differences, is that you can go to Oakland, California, or you can go to Abbot Kinney in Los Angeles, or you can go to, Newberry Street in Boston, any, streets in Cambridge, Massachusetts, wherever it is, Asheville, North Carolina, and find really cool like local stores, people who are selling their own pottery or curating gifts or whatever it might be. That's what makes towns and communities interesting and vibrant. And so it's all of our responsibility to support those businesses, because we don't want a world that just looks the same. That's not interesting. It's not good for anybody.
Claire, I should add, because I love what Guy just said. And, I'm a bit of an activist. And so I would also say that to the extent that we work at large corporations, because sometimes you don't think about yourself, when you're working in a large corporation, but imagine if everybody within the reach of this call was able to ask their employer how much they procure from a small business. At the federal government, there's a mandate that at least 23% of the federal spend go to small business. And so what if we not mandated, but what if we inspired corporations in every city and county and state across the country to match that procurement goal? That would also bode really well for the future of our country.
Thank you both. What would you like to see changed in secondary and higher education to encourage entrepreneurship and help students get started strong?
And help get what started strong?
Get students, young entrepreneurs. Yeah.
I mean, I think the first thing is to unshackle students from the crushing debt load that they carry after they graduate. That is this is why we talk about the United States as this as kind of this wonderful place to be an entrepreneur, and it is, but there are so many advantages in so many ways that people in countries where they don't pay for university or they have universal health care, they have advantages they have in starting businesses because they don't worry about those things. And I think that one of the key things we need to do is to tackle this crushing debt load. I mean, a 22-year-old kid starting life with $100,000 in debt is not a way to start your life or career out. It's not acceptable. I also think that there are ways to incentivize people to pursue not just entrepreneurial careers, but careers that we we need. I mean, doctors, nurses. I would love to see a future where medical schools are free for young people who want to pursue medicine. I mean, these are for teachers. These are professions that are essential. But I think the primary thing here is we have to, as much as we can, eliminate student debt, because that is, essentially you're starting your life out, your adult life out, with both hands tied behind your back, and that is not an acceptable way, in my view, to start out and to try and build a career.
It is very stifling. There's no question. I mean, what he just said, we need to take to heart. That needs to be addressed in a national, important, and serious conversation and action thereafter. Locally, in terms of our community education, one of the frustrations that I had as an entrepreneur is when I was very first starting out, I needed to have a bookkeeper. And I actually ran an ad about, asking for a bookkeeper. And I was really disappointed to see how few bookkeepers there were and how tied up they were. And so I've been talking to the local community colleges to say, can we have layered education so that we can have somebody who takes a really good math class and be given some skill set, and I could hire them at the beginning of my journey as an entrepreneur, and then they get the next degree, and then they become a junior accountant, and then they can help me, and then they finally get the 4-year degree and they become a CFO, but some sort of certification so that they can start with a skill set. I think that we need more skills, especially as we undergo this climate change industry that we're going to be creating. We need people who understand solar roofing, placement, and there's so many things. So I think it's a two-pronged strategy that we could consider. And one is technical skills of the future. How do you repair a Tesla if you've been working on a gas powered car? So all the skill sets that we need for the future, I think that's something that we have to think about, as I said. And then the second part of it is that the degrees reflect, so that you don't have to wait for 6 years to come out with a master's and a a CPA degree to be able to get into the business. That if you are certified at certain levels, you can begin and then grow as your company is growing. Layered education.
Very cool. I've never heard of that, but that's a super interesting point. Pivoting a little bit to your book now, a lot of reviewers seem to appreciate your idea for structuring the book with solid examples. What was the ideation process like when writing the book, and why did you decide to share these stories in the way that you did?
I really wanted to create a book that I would want to read. You know, I am not, I've always been entrepreneurial in my thinking, but for most of my career, I worked for an organization before I started my own business. I was entrepreneurial within that business. And what I wanted to do was to also offer up this idea that being an entrepreneur isn't just about hanging a shingle out in front of your house and saying, I'm open for business. It's a mindset. It's a way of thinking about what you do. Being entrepreneurial means solving problems, thinking creatively, figuring out ways around obstacles, coming up with ideas, working in a collaborative team. You know, you think about some of the most amazing products we use every day. I mean, our iPhones, these were not created by entrepreneurs. These were created by internal entrepreneurs, right? Johnny Ive was an entrepreneur with an Apple who built this transformational product. So I wanted people to see this book as both a kind of a roadmap for how to think about starting a business, from all the way from how to come up with an idea to, to how to find funding, to how to find a co-founder, to when to pivot, how to do your research, how to build buzz and create momentum for your product. But I also wanted it to be a book for people who, who could sort of use who would sort of have a framework, an architectural framework for how to think creatively about what they do. And that's really how I thought about structuring the book, and I hope I've accomplished that in writing it.
Great, thank you. And then just another question: are there any examples of startups from your book that caused you to say, "I wish I thought of that"?
So many. I mean, one of the best and simplest businesses I've ever profiled is 1-800-GOT-JUNK. It's an amazing concept because Brian Scudamore had $400. He bought a used flatbed truck. After 3 or 4 jobs of hauling junk from people's homes, he paid off the car. Another 3 or 4 jobs, he had another $500. He bought a second truck, hired a friend, and that's how he built his business. I mean, they were essentially, every 3 or 4 jobs, they would just buy a cheap flatbed truck. And the concept of that business is so simple. They're hauling junk from people's homes, and on the side of the trucks, he would paint 1-800-GOT-JUNK. And that was the fundamental beginnings of his business. A very simple concept, and it's a brilliant concept. It didn't require a lot of capital. And today it's a multi-billion-dollar business, operating all around the world.
Great, and I'll combine a few of these last audience questions for both of you. One person is wondering what some suggested skills are for a budding entrepreneur, and then Maria, we'll go back to you with some resources available to small businesses through the SBA.
If you're a budding entrepreneur, I would suggest you gain experience in rejection. If you can get a sales job and you can learn how to hear the words no, not interested, no soliciting, and you can withstand that again and again, it will help you build the kind of resilience you will need to start your own business, because you will hear no a lot. You will hear a lot of rejection. You will hear a lot of people tell you that's impossible, it can't be done. If it's so great, why didn't other people do it? And you need to be able to hear that and plow forward. And one of the best ways to do that is to get a job in sales, because in sales you will hear a lot of people saying no.
I'll just say that for anybody who has not visited the SBA.gov website, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. The way the SBA looks at the world is through 3 C's, and I'm just oversimplifying things here. And so what you want to do is think about, like, what do I need first? Even before capital, I need to know that I have the technical skills, that I have a good business plan. Is it sound? Does it, fit my personality, my market, that sort of thing. And so we start with consulting, and the SBA has consulting centers across the country. They're called the Small Business Development Centers, and sometimes they come under the name of Veterans Business Outreach Centers. They have Women Business Centers. So if you look up under the SBA.gov website, you'll find all the different centers that are in your community and within your reach. But for sure, the website is got all of that rich information. The second thing that we think about then is, then you need customers, the marketplace. And so then we think of contracts and how you can get contracts. And again, as I mentioned before, the federal government by Congress, by law, is required to meet a 23% minimum threshold of contracting with small businesses. So you can look at ways in which to get some of that small business share. And then third, of course, then you need to capitalize that plan. And so capital, we put out capital through financial institutions, as well as through, we have SBIR is a really, when I say we, I'm not there anymore. I was in the prior administration, but the SBA has a program called SBIR, which is one of my favorites because it provides small businesses who have an innovative idea that is responsive to the federal government's needs. It provides just pure grants. For example, the guy that came up for the Defense Department needed to find a way to save lives when they went into an aggressive military action. And so they wanted to send computers, little robots, in to see if there were any people inside buildings, for example. And somebody came up with this technology to be able to let them go in and see what was going on. And so as a result, that technology is now the Roomba vacuum cleaner that we use today. Those are the kinds of ideas that the federal government is looking for around cybersecurity, around DARPA, education, agriculture, aeroponics, for example, in agriculture. So all these ideas can be funded through grants at the SBIR. And finally, if you're ready to scale, they have the SBIC program, which is Small Business Investment Companies. And that's where you can get mezzanine and private equity capital. It's just lots of rich information there. I highly recommend it.
Great. Thank you so much for answering these questions. Maria, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, I thought that for our last question that we would do is just have a 2-minute, what I call policy hackathon. As was just mentioned, people really want to know, like, what can the government do for me? And so many here at Town Hall are influential thought leaders in the community. And so they want to know, like, what if they're talking to the mayor, if they're talking to a local county supervisor, talking to somebody in the governor's office, or if they want to write a letter, send an email, what is the policy hack or something that the government could do to make life easier for small businesses? What is the frustration that you're hearing across our country?
Maria, I've said this 1,000 times, and I'll say it 1,000 times more: universal health care, because businesses and small businesses should not be taking that on themselves. The idea of small businesses providing health insurance for their employees is a huge burden and something that's very difficult. And I think that we can solve that problem if we had a universal health insurance, a public option for people that would take the burden off small businesses and that would enable people, ordinary people, to leave their jobs and become entrepreneurs without the fear of losing their health insurance. I think we actually will see an explosion of innovation in this country if everybody has access to health insurance without worrying about losing it.
Amen. And if they could leave their employer where they're unhappy, but they can't now because they can't take their health care with them, right? And so obviously that's why I supported Obamacare for some of the same reasons. But anyway, thank you so much. I just can't tell you what a delight this is. If I can just share one of the challenges that I would push before we turn to Kim very quickly, I'll just say that across the country, mayors, city council members can also think about how they regulate, in other words, how they permit small businesses. When I started my first small business, I can't tell you how many lines I stood in line to get all my requisite permitting. And so I launched, when I was in office, a program called Startup in a Day and challenged mayors across the country to make it much easier and to streamline the online permitting for small businesses. And so we ask every mayor across the country to continue to do that work, to make it easier so that you can have a vibrant city that really represents the exceptionalism of America, and to continue to make sure that we are the preeminent source of freedom in the world. Kim, thank you so much for indulging us and allowing us this hour with your audience.
Maria and Guy, thank you for such an inspirational and helpful conversation today. We appreciate not only your time, but both of your expertise. I've been taking notes during the whole hour, and I'm going to check into the SBA myself. And of course, please buy Guy's book, How I Built This. I'm going to be reading the rest of it tonight. So wonderful, wonderful ideas. Thank you both so very much. And since the Council Town Hall is a small business, for our viewers and members, help us keep this going. You can text the word GIVE to the phone number on the screen. Every bit helps. If you want these great programs to continue, we need your ongoing support. This week, we've got a terrific lineup of live streams, which we're offering for free. Tomorrow, we have Ron Brownstein, CNN commentator, who will be talking about who will be deciding the presidential election. And then tomorrow we have, on the 21st, we have How to Win the Tech Race with China. And of course, on Thursday, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnur. So thank you all for watching. Maria and Guy, thank you again so very much. Everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you soon.